Chairman, in this the Queen Quet coming to from the UN for the Racism-Durban conference for Gullah Geechee TV on the North edition of what going on. So tune in and get a little bit more about what's coming from around the world for eliminating racism and discrimination.
And now, I give the floor to His Excellency Rahmatullah Muhammad Uthman, Under Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Sudan, who will speak on behalf of the African states.
Excellencies, heads of state and government, President of the 6th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Nasser Abdul Aziz al-Nasser, Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great honor to address this high-level meeting on behalf of the African Group to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, adopted by consensus as the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. The DDPA is the most comprehensive, action-oriented global framework to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. The group welcomes the progress made at the national, regional, and international levels in conformity with the obligations and commitments of Durban. This event undoubtedly provides a timely opportunity to assess the progress made in implementation of the outcome of the conference, identify the obstacles and challenges encountered, and to find the appropriate solution they require. Today, we do not only commemorate Durban, but we reaffirm and renew our firm global political commitment to the full and effective implementation of the DDPA and the outcome of Durban review in 2009. We are also encouraged by those governments that have adopted, since the adoption of Durban Declaration and Program of Action, landmark and progressive legislative and administrative measures to effectively combat racism, racial discrimination, protection of the rights of migrants and racial, national or ethnic and linguistic minorities, and to combat incitement to hatred based on religion or belief. Despite these efforts undertaken by the international community, governments and local authorities, the scourge of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance persist and continue to result in violations of human rights, suffering, disadvantage, and violence. We are also still concerned that there has been a diminishing of civil liberties. We are alarmed by these assaults on human rights and the recurrence of violent incidents of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and the related intolerance. We also note that the decisive steps to be taken by some member states, the United Nations system, and the international community at large to oppose racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance persist, and to enhance dialogue with the aim of understanding and promoting tolerance and full respect of cultural and ethnic diversity. These efforts must be complemented and strengthened through responsible media and awareness campaigns and the promotion of the principles of tolerance, mutual respect, and understanding through the educational systems. Mr. Chairman, The African Group welcomes the commemoration of the adoption of the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. The African Group believes that this commemoration expresses a unique opportunity to rebuild a strong international consensus and mark the renewal of international engagement in the struggle against racism and racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. In the light of the persistent challenges, we should translate our commitment into action and take appropriate measures to implement the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, as well as the outcome document of the Durban Review Conference, which constitutes the most comprehensive international framework to fight against racism. Furthermore, it is indispensable to address with greater resolve and political will all forms and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance in all spheres of life and in all parts of the world, including all those under foreign occupation. The African Group believes that this commemoration is well attended and the declaration by this high-level meeting would be adopted by consensus by all participant states, which express the international community will, which should be united against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Mr. President, the group emphasized that the momentum gained by the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action and their follow-up mechanism, particularly within the United Nations system, will further strengthen the DDPA and create further impetus for the accelerated implementation by states and other actors of the laudable objectives encapsulated in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. The DDPA adopts a victim-oriented approach to problem of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Specific recommendations are formulated to combat discrimination against Africans and persons of African descent, Asians and persons of African descent, indigenous people, migrants, refugees, minorities, the Rome, and other groups. The group emphasizes that the pledges and commitment made must be effectively implemented by all states, which retain their primary responsibility in this respect. Reaffirms that the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the Durban Declaration and Program of Action remains the basis and fundamental legal framework for the effective elimination of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and the related intolerance. Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, the group reiterates that slavery and slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade, new and emerging forms of slavery, such as human trafficking, apartheid, and colonialism, must never be forgotten in this regard. And in this regard, welcomes actions undertaken to honor the memory of the victims through the establishment of the memorial commemorating the 200 years of abolishing transatlantic slave trade and slavery at the premises of the United Nations in New York. Furthermore, the group recalls the adoption of the General Assembly resolution titled United Nations Global Action on to combat trafficking in persons and urges for its implementation. Mr. President, the African Group at this event will provide an opportunity for heads of state and government to mobilize political will. We would like to see this 10th anniversary celebrated in a befitting manner during the roundtable discussion, the culmination of which will be the adoption of an outcome that encapsulates the global resolve and to end racism and place victims at the center of our deliberation. Before ending, Mr. President, I would like that the African Group supports the proposal made by His Excellency the President of South Africa to adopt the declaration at the end of this morning session. I thank you.
racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance remain stubborn features of the global landscape. We see these manifested in Afrophobia, Islamophobia, religious intolerance, anti-Semitism, xenophobia towards migrants, refugees, displaced persons, and asylum seekers, in the general abuse of human rights, in penal systems, and in other discriminatory actions. As we gather here today, in this place, in this International Year for People of African Descent, in this 10th anniversary year of the DDPA, just a few months after the ending of the decade for a culture of peace and dialogue among civilizations, it is imperative that we commit ourselves anew to a future in which everyone has a rightful place and collectively seek to address the problems being faced by victims. But based on my working group's mandate, especially the victims who are African or African descended people, it is no secret, co-chairs, delegates, that people of African descent have for centuries been victims of racism, racial discrimination, and enslavement, and of the denial by history of many of their rights. In trying to explain the roots of such discrimination, the DDPA stated, and I quote, "We acknowledge that slavery and the slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade, were appalling tragedies in the history of humanity," end of quote. And of course, we further add that slavery and the transatlantic trade in African captives were crimes against humanity. We use this high-level meeting to call on states that sanction this crime against humanity to take immediate steps, first to apologize unreservedly, and not resort to linguistic obfuscation that limits apologies, and secondly, to negotiate with the representatives of victims a respectful reparation package based on the contributions of their ancestors to European development. Students of history will recall that in 1944, Trinidadian Eric Williams published Capitalism and Slavery and placed Caribbean slavery within the context of Atlantic modernity. Chattel slavery was an integral part of North Atlantic capitalist accumulation and subject to the forces of the market economy. We call on Africans and people of African descent everywhere, first, to unite around the cause of reparation, second, to support the recommendation that there be a UN Permanent Forum for African and people of African descent. Part of that march toward peace, justice, and equal rights involves righting the injustices of the past, set out so clearly in the DDPA. And reparation is a route to that world peace. The late Jamaican artist Peter Tosh already told us that there will be no peace without equal rights and justice. And Bob Marley, using the philosophy of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, long cautioned, and I paraphrase, "Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war. Until there are no longer first-class and second-class citizens of any nation, until the color of a person's skin is of no more significance than the color of his or her eyes, until the basic human rights are equally guaranteed to all, without regard to race, this is a war. That until that day, the dream of lasting peace, world citizenship, and rule of international morality will remain but a fleeting illusion to be pursued but never attained." Co-chairs, excellencies, delegates, I invite you to read my full paper, which has been circulated, so that you can see the elaboration of some of these points that I have raised. But I want to say to people of African descent, to Africans everywhere, never give up the fight for justice, for recognition and development. Our ancestors never did. Otherwise, many of us would still be enslaved and in chains. So I end with God's charge to all Africans and people of African descent. Up you mighty race. You can accomplish what you will. Thank you.
That's right. Very good. So, Hannah, on this year, the Queen Quet Quet head on the body of the Gullah Geechee Nation after we done left this year day with a focus on racial discrimination and things like that. Now, Hunter children yet with the cracky teeth, but more than that, Hunter yet the other people in the world of cracky teeth say to work toward this year. Now, one thing, we ain't have to adopt this year thing and we land because we not stand for none of these year thing. But then somebody say, well, y'all ain't half because y'all are one ethnicity. But still, Hunter can have forms of discrimination and prejudice that Hunter children know what men to talk about and things like that. And separate your name. Instead of Gullah Geechee, they'll say Geechee. Or you'll call yourself some separation and things like that. That is how them type of thing come where the world have to then work against them. So Hunter children, work together children. Don't you get worried. The great camp to meet in the promised land. And we're so glad that we had a chance to meet this year day, one more again at the UN for work against racism in the world and things like that. So Hunter children, keep on keeping on, keep on holding on, and this year the work going on. Peace and blessing.